Perfect. Okay. Thank you for joining us, everyone, this morning for how to know when combined backup and replication is for you. My name is James. I'm going to be the host for today, and I'm the only person on the session today, so we will be running through the agenda now, and in particular for questions. We won't be answering any questions as I run through the session, but anything that you've got, type it in on the right-hand side, and we'll go through those at the end of the session. If there are any questions that we don't manage to get to, I'm always very keen that we do respond to everything, so we will respond to anything personally, or if there's a lot of questions that are very useful that could be shared with the group, we will put that either on a blog post or we'll put it in the email that we send out to all of you later on. And that's always question number one, which is, will slides be made available after the session? So yes, we'll send out the slides later today, along with the recording of this session and any other resources, some pieces that I'm going to mention later on the presentation itself. So if you have ever joined us for a webinar in the past, you'll know that we'll always start with a bit of a quick plug for our podcast, which is the Business Continuity Podcast, or the BCP Cast. Now, what we're talking about today is all about technology. We're talking about backup and we're talking about replication technologies. But when we're looking at IT resilience and business continuity in the broader sense, technology is just a part of that. And in my opinion, it's probably the easier and the slightly smaller part of the two. We also need to think about our people, about our suppliers, about our locations, about how we communicate with the press and through social media, how we deal with the crisis itself. And one of the things that I think we've learned in providing these services for a number of years is that for a lot of small businesses, these are things that they're not entirely familiar with. So we took the decision a couple of years ago to put together a podcast. So we've been going out and interviewing big professional business continuity managers at some of the largest and most interesting organizations that we can find. So folks from The Economist, from the Wellcome Trust, from Google, from BP, from the London 2012 Olympic Games, and getting these folks to give us an insight into their world, about how they plan for major disruptions, tell us some of the stories that they've been through, what they've learned from. And the good thing about, I think, all of these folks is that potentially there's a risk that they only have that experience of how you would do this in a really big organization, but actually they're all very practical, very reasonable people, and we always make sure we get them to give us advice for how they can apply these things for businesses with fewer people or with less resource, to make how you can make yourself really resilient. So have a listen. You can either listen directly at thebcpcast.com, or you can subscribe at iTunes or Apple Podcasts, or through Stitcher. So give it a listen. So anyway, back to today. So one of the things we're going to cover today. So we're going to look at, get rid of our AV there. We're going to look at the different approaches for backup and replication. We're going to take a look at the vendor landscape. So who's providing these services in a combined package and how they're doing that. We're then going to have some examples, so some specific almost case studies of particular technologies and how they're doing that, how they're combining the two. And then finally, how to decide if a combined product is for you. So what are those criteria? And then hopefully you can answer that question as to whether or not this is a route that's going to work for you. So I'll start with the question, why would you ever use more than one product? Less is obviously more. If you can swing Occam's razor and do the same with fewer products, it's less complexity. That makes sense. That's a good thing to do. Why would you ever do anything more than that? So I'll throw in the obligatory Apple/Steve Jobs analogy here. When Steve Jobs introduced the iPhone, he didn't pitch it as one thing. He pitched it as three. So from his speech, he said, in 2001, we introduced the first iPod, and it didn't just change the way we all listen to music, it changed the entire music industry. Well, today we're introducing three revolutionary products of this class. The first one is a widescreen iPod with touch controls. The second is a revolutionary mobile phone. And the third is a breakthrough internet communications device. And he then repeated that to really stress the point. And this is one of those presentations that always gets wheeled out as a great example of Jobs' ability to present a new idea. And at one of these big Apple conferences in his denim jeans and his roll neck, really pitch something new to us. But it works. This makes an awful lot of sense. None of us now walk around with an iPod and an iPhone and an internet device in our pocket all separately, along with a compass and a map, or all of those things. It's all been combined into a single device, and all for the better of it. But the question we're really asking today is combined backup and replication more of an iPhone, or is it more of a pen with a clock in it? And that's to say, are we getting the best of both worlds in a simple product? Or when we combine these two products, are we getting one product that does two things badly? So let's start with the question here. So what's the difference between backup and DR? And I am knowingly using the term DR rather than replication, which we're talking about. I'll explain why. So bear with me here. I know this sounds like it's one of those terrible wedding speeches where someone's the dictionary definition of love is, but no, that's not it. If we're looking at a single product and we're asking if it can do two things for us, then we need to nail down what those two things are. So backup, these are the ways that we define these two processes. So backup is individual file recovery and long-term data retention for governance, risk, and compliance. And disaster recovery is rapid server recovery from major IT incidents. Now, we're IT continuity specialists, so obviously we tend to be pretty hot on the terminology. Most people aren't as militant about these terms as we tend to be. So we work with a wide range of different kinds of businesses. There'll be the big corporate regulated businesses, and then the really small micro businesses with no IT staff at all. And we've got these two illustrated here in these two photos. Obviously, we've got our friendly, happy, pink-haired baker lady in beautiful color on the left, and then our staid corporate suit-wearing, briefcase-carrying folks in kind of corporate world on the right-hand side. Now, if you speak to those people on the left-hand side, and really all of our organizations are going to sit somewhere on that continuum, they'll tend to use terms like backup, DR, and business continuity quite interchangeably. They'll say things like, oh, our backups are our business continuity plan, or our disaster recovery, that's John and Dave over there. And then obviously someone like myself, I'll wince and say, no, stop it, you're getting the terms wrong. Actually, for what they're trying to achieve, they're right. They're small businesses, so they don't need the enormous amount of documentation and process that you have to have for a larger business to organize your continuity. When something goes wrong for those businesses, they can go out and buy a new server. We can restore their backups to them, and we'll keep them going. They may be down for a day, for 2 days. That might be acceptable. Actually, in this example, probably with a bakery, it's a poor example for that. But smaller businesses that can allow for a certain amount of downtime, that's okay. And the backup, its purpose is to be the recovery itself and to bring them back and keep them up and running. They're not really concerned about having worm compliant storage for their backups and having year-end copies for financial regulatory compliance reasons, or to have copies of data that they might get trawled out in some HR case of a legal case brought against the company as the larger business was. On the other hand, we've got those large businesses that will need to replicate their data so they can restore servers in minutes and keep the business going, so they're minimizing their downtime. But then equally, they need all of those copies. So the point here is that we're somewhere between those two. So we need to ask ourselves the questions of what are the things that we're trying to achieve? What do we want from our products? I've tried to boil this down into kind of a couple of simple things. So we've got the recovery objectives that we want to meet. These are really, really easy, and this is a good one for us to be able to kind of assess the different products by, because they're very recordable and they're very testable. So when we talk about recovery objectives, we're talking about recovery point objectives, or RPOs, and recovery time objectives. So your recovery point, that's the point that you would recover to. So if you're replicating every 4 hours, it's 4 hours. If you're backing up once per day, that's 24 hours. And that then translates to how much data do you end up losing? How much data will you have to re-input once you've got systems up and running again? Recovery time objective, that's how long from the point that you kick off that recovery will it take until those servers are operational again. And that could be instantaneous, it could be minutes, or it could be, if you're recovering from a backup, several hours. We then want to ask ourselves, how long do we need our historic copies of data, and how many versions do we need to keep? And this, I'm being careful here to not to use the term backup, because as we're going to look at, there are some slightly different approaches that perhaps if we can be slightly more flexible with how we phrase these and how we look at our requirement, then it gives us more options of what we might be able to choose. And then lastly, what are the risks and threats that we're mitigating? What are the things that we're trying to recover from? And for most of us, these are all going to be the same types of issues. So we're going to have a local issue at a data center, and that could be a fire, a flood, could even be theft of any of the servers or the OT equipment. It could be all of the most common causes for data loss that we find whenever we do our annual survey, and those are hardware failure, software failure, and human error. But then the one that I think probably is most interesting here and has probably been the biggest change in the last few years is all of the various kinds of cyber threats that you need to recover from. I'd say probably 5 years ago, just before we had the big wave of ransomware incidents, actually a lot of folks were pushing way towards replicating their systems and not really worrying about the number of versions they would need to recover from. Then obviously ransomware comes in, you need to be able to recover from a slightly older copy because those infections may have been on the system for a little longer, and now we're seeing lots of other kinds of cyber threats where that's also the case, and that's changing what are those things that then perhaps that we need to recover from. So let's look at the technology landscape and all of the different options we've got. So here's a handful of the vendors that exist in the data protection space that you might be able to choose from. Now, some of these are names that have been around for decades. So people like COMMVAULT, like Veritas, Backup Exec, like IBM, and then some of these are some of the kind of hotter upstarts, the new folks that are getting lots of VC investment from Silicon Valley. So guys like Cohesity, like Rubrik, like HVR. And the one thing that perhaps is slightly different from the data protection market to a lot of the other technology markets, if you were to look at, say, a database technology or a particular storage technology, is there's actually quite a lot of vendors here. If you read the storage press, it's one of the things that does get mentioned a lot. You don't really see the consolidation that we see in some of the other technology areas. And I think for me, the downside of this is actually it can be quite confusing to know what you're getting from any of these. So we'll try to group them a little bit to make it a bit more understandable. And this is the way that we tend to look at this market. So we tend to think of some products that are very much backup first software, others are replication first software, and then some are converged appliances. So some of these products absolutely started life as a backup product. So things like Backup Exec, like Asigra, like ArcServe, like COMMVAULT. Now those products have since gone on to add replication methods and technologies. On the other side, we've got things like perhaps DoubleTake or Zerto, which started life as a replication product, but are now adding extended journals or versioning to roll back. And then you've got the converged appliances, which are all kind of packaged up in a single, easy to buy, easy to set up box. And I think really the aim for these is that they're trying to be a combined product from its inception, but actually in a lot of cases, as we're on to, they probably tend to lean more towards backup or towards replication. Now, this is by no means the only way you could split up that market. To give another example, here are a few of the categories that I came across and this was a very well-known analyst report. So they set up the market into next-gen scale-out backup appliances, recovery orchestration tools, hyper-converged appliances with integrated backup, array-based snapshots, copy data management, and software-defined storage with bundled data protection. Every so often, one of these will be the supposed reason that backup is going to be removed altogether and won't exist any longer, and I think that's regularly proven not to be the case. Now, I personally think with some of these categories, they're not entirely separate. Some of these are perhaps more of a marketing spin rather than they are actually a technological difference in the way that the products work. But again, I can see very easily how it's easy to be confused by all of these different classifications and what you actually get from any of these products, because quite often they'll talk about doing things in a similar way, but they don't necessarily deliver that. So let's roll back to our categories, the way that we've set this up, and let's look at a few of the pros and cons. Now, with the backup first software, the scheduling and the way that you set up each of those, the backup windows and schedules tends to be very comprehensive. They tend to be very efficient at storage. And I should note here, for all of these cases, I'm talking purely about disk-based or cloud-based storage. I'm not talking about backing up to tape. These products that are backing up lots and lots of volumes and lots of copies of data, they just by their nature, they have to be efficient in how they use the storage using technologies like dgep or common file elimination, for instance. And the backup software tends to be very, very efficient when you're recovering individual files, a couple of files. You can find them quickly, recover them back to wherever you need them to be. But if you need to recover a large volume of data or your entire environment, then you're going to get a very long RTO for recovery from that backup copy. Now, the replication first software, it's the flip side of that. So the full server recovery is really, really quick, but kind of by the nature of the way that they've been built, and originally you weren't really looking for long-term retention from these, they tend to be a little more inefficient in how they store the data. As a result, you've got a limited recovery window because you can't afford to keep lots and lots of copies that go back a really long time. And then they tend to be slower. Well, they're either not possible to recover an individual file, or in a lot of cases it is possible, but it's a slightly more convoluted process to pull out an individual file to recover. For the converged appliances, stepping aside from whether they're replication first or backup first on this, they're really easy to install. They're generally really easy to manage. They're a simple converged, combined appliance. But the downside to them is that they're very much off the rack and not made to measure. And we're going to look at Rubrik in a little bit of detail later on. But what happens when you package it all up and make it nice and simple for someone to buy? You have to take some shortcuts on how it's put together. So you make some assumptions. And if you're a business that's kind of regular shaped, then that's great. You're going to get the benefit of that they've been able to produce that at scale. But if you're a very odd shaped business with an odd number of sites or a large amount of data for the number of servers, for instance, that you might be protecting, then it might not be something that works out, and you'd be better off picking the software and using the hardware specific for it. So kind of a couple of quick kind of pros and cons of each approach. Now, for any of these approaches, there are a few things that you really want to kind of keep an eye out for and watch out to see you don't get caught in the way that some of these products are described. So the first thing is to look at RTOs and RPOs. So when you're assessing these different technologies, we tend to think of these metrics as being a bit like your miles per gallon or your 0 to 60 times, or even like the battery life that you'd get on a laptop when you're picking a new laptop. You know, if there's a review in a magazine that says it's Apple are listing this as a 10-hour battery life, the best you're going to get is probably 8 hours, for instance. And that's a good way to think of some of these RTO and RPO metrics. They're the kind of lab conditions best you'll ever see. So speak to your peers, speak to any customers of those products, find out what they get in real life. We, for instance, we'll be pretty honest with customers of ours when we're setting up a product for them. Say, actually, look, this product has a kind of best case situation of an RPO of 0. You could be getting it down to absolutely nothing, but we never see that happen in real life. Best case, due to bandwidth limitations, it's probably going to be every 15 minutes. It could be up to every hour. That's not necessarily a product with a fault of the product, but it's how that then works with the bandwidth. And then equally for recovery time objectives, we just published a case study of a customer of ours who changed from using Veeam to using Zerto, and the issue that they had was that actually Veeam was relatively quick at recovering a number of servers, but they had some very large SQL servers, and they took 6 hours to recover. However, using a different technology, it was down to about an hour. So kind of keep an eye on those things, and not just the figure that's quoted on the pack. Look for what it's like in real life. Recovery on the appliance, however, is for me a little bit less like one of those lab condition perfect figures, and it's a bit closer to an outright lie. So some of the combined backup and recovery appliances will claim that you can restore all of your servers on a single appliance. And you might think, well, that seems odd, that I'm going to suddenly be able to recover all of my racks of hardware and run it on a 2U appliance with slow storage and a fraction of the compute. And you'd be right, it's impossible. It's not plausible. We reviewed a technology a few years ago that was very hyped at the time. They were very proudly stating that you could recover 50 servers and run it on a single appliance. And we just couldn't for the life of us work out how that might be possible. And as soon as we started having a proper conversation with that technology provider, they backed down pretty quickly and said, no, it's not 50, it's probably not even half of that, and in the real world we wouldn't recommend doing it for a small fraction. So if there is a claim that seems to be too good to be true, make sure you get a vendor to prove it first. And then the last thing of kind of bits to watch out for is storage implications. So the first we've mentioned already, some of these products are just better at managing the storage and they're more efficient. So for a number of versions, it'll keep it much more efficiently. So something like an Asigra would be very efficient versus something more journal based that will be less efficient. The second element of this though is if you've got a product that is less efficient with storage, but is able to use some of the lower cost tiers of cloud storage, thinking here things like Nearline from Google or Glacier from AWS, then that becomes a bit less of a problem because yes, it's producing a lot of data, but the cost implication isn't as great. And then finally, some products in the way that they do the backup and replication will be able to do that from a single storage footprint. Others will need two. You'll have your backup, and then it'll be recovering into a separate kind of warm or hot copy of data. Now, in some cases, you can do that at the point of recovery. In others, it's something that you'll need to be keeping all the time. Now, obviously, this isn't a downside versus using two separate products that'll always do that, but it's one of those things that's worth keeping an eye out for because you might think, I'm going to make a massive storage saving, but by the time you've kind of worked through it, it might not necessarily be the case. So now let's look at some of the example vendors. So we've got 4 here, and they all have a slightly different approach in the way that they do this. And I think hopefully this will give a kind of a good idea about what kinds of products might be a good idea depending on your need. So the first tech that we're going to talk about is Veeam. And I think probably for most people, when you talk about combined backup and replication, Veeam is the product that you think about. They've literally got a product called Veeam Backup and Replication, so makes sense. I used to think of them as being a kind of a newcomer and an upstart, but they've been around for 10 years. They've got a massive install base, originally for VMware, but since added Hyper-V, since added physical servers too. And the way that Veeam works is that it does incremental backup and image-based replication. And then as a quick kind of point here of a note, one of the things we mentioned obviously is with some replication products, one of the downsides is if you want a single file recovered, then it can be a slightly more painful process. They do that very well. So they can do file level recovery, so you can restore that quickly without needing to boot a VM, which obviously is a big time saver. Now, in terms of kind of pros and cons of Veeam, for us, I think it's one product that does both things quite well. I'd say perhaps we said it's a 6 out of 10 for both backup and replication, whereas some of the other products we're going to look at might be more like an 8 and a 9 out of 10 for backup, but a 3 for replication, or the other way around. Veeam doesn't necessarily excel at both, but it's really solid at both. And I think the other thing that's worth mentioning with Veeam is that in terms of the use case, I know a lot of very large organizations that will use Veeam as a supplementary technology, so something extra that they use for a specific need. But for smaller businesses, it's quite often it will be the kind of the sole IT resilience technology. So it'll be something that replaces all backup and replication. So from Veeam, we'll move on. Bear with me 1 second. So the second technology we're looking at is COMMVAULT. So COMMVAULT, probably the best known enterprise backup software product, very, very feature rich, and it's got a kind of a long list of the way that they do combined backup and recovery methods. Now, the first is a technique called live mount, and that is the ability to mount the VM directly from backup storage. So no changes are kept. If you kind of trash that server at the end of it, you're not keeping anything. So it's good for testing, or if you want to keep changes, then you can vMotion that back onto production storage. It has file replication, and it does that in a couple of ways. So you've got what they call fan in and fan out methods, and that means you can either go from multiple locations into one, or from one location to multiple targets. And the use case for the first is perhaps you've got a small office, or several small offices and you want to replicate all of that data into a central hub. The second is that perhaps you've got one central location, but you want to replicate that to a secondary site, and then maybe on also to a cloud target. So file replication, relatively straightforward, but a couple of kind of interesting methods of how they do that there. They do backup and recovery between public clouds, and probably should have underlined that. I think the interesting point here is between. Now, a lot of the technologies that we'll look at will give you the option to do a backup or a replication within the same cloud, and nice, but perhaps not super exciting, because there's often a lot of native tools that would do something similar for cheaper. So in Azure, for instance, you might use Azure Backup or you might use ASR. But one of the bits that's always quite tricky is to be able to replicate between the public clouds. And one of the things that COMMVAULT has recently added is the ability to do cross-cloud recovery and handling the conversion of the server instances at the point of backup. The last two items we've got here, and I'll say again, one of the things that's pretty terrible in the data protection industry is some of the terminology we use for some of these things. So we've got live mount and then live sync, and two variations of live sync. But the first is live sync replication for virtual machines, and that is automated recovery to be used ready in disaster. So what that means is COMMVAULT does a regular backup of your data, but then from that backup, it then carries out an automatic restore, and this is into a second data repository. So this is what we mentioned, where you're keeping two lots of your data. And then every time you do a backup, it carries out a tiny incremental restore and just keeps that recovery system up to date at any point. So if you need to invoke, you don't need to carry out a full recovery. Your data is already there and up to date. And then the last point, so live sync IO, is VIO-based replication. VIO is VMware's vSphere API for hypervisor level replication. That is really interesting. It's interesting we talk about the next technology too. So in terms of pros and cons of COMMVAULT, it's probably the most fully featured data protection software. We're big fans. No software is great, but generally whenever they bring in a feature, it's reliable and it really works. I'd say probably the only downside is kind of the nature of any very fully featured software. It tends to be perhaps more difficult to navigate through the UI. When there's versions that come through, you'll have something that's gets lost from a drop down on one menu and put somewhere else. It's one of the things that kind of our guys will say, keeping up with that is trickier compared with some of the other more simple products. But I mean, when you're as fully featured, I think that's probably kind of par for the course. So the VIO-based replication is interesting because whereas COMMVAULT is the enterprise backup software that's now getting into replication, Zerto is the opposite way around. So Zerto made its name as hypervisor level replication using kind of VIO for VMware. It since has expanded what it can do in terms of the replication. So adding Hyper-V, adding public cloud, both as a source and a destination. But Zerto's kind of most interesting new addition is it's added backup, and that's backup in inverted commas there because they're approaching it in a slightly different way. So Zerto keeps historic versions of the data through a journal. Originally, I think when we started using Zerto many years ago, that journal was really, really short because you only ever wanted to pull back the last version that you were working on. Then, we kind of went through the period where ransomware kind of suddenly became very prevalent, and it was pretty clear that journal needed to extend, so that jumped up to kind of 14 or 30 days. But now the next stage beyond that is that we've got an elastic journal, and that means being able to copy data from a short-term repository to a long-term repository. Now, pros and cons, I guess the con is this is a kind of new, different way to take this on, but as a positive, and this is why I think I mentioned earlier on that if you can take a kind of, I guess, a fresh look at what your objectives are, what you actually need from a product, perhaps in many cases this is something that's going to fit for you. And then the final tech that we're going to look at is Rubrik. Now, we actually held a webinar on Rubrik earlier this year. It was introducing Rubrik, a new approach to data protection. I've got the kind of the link at the end here. Much hyped, constantly in the press. They've got lots and lots of investment, and they're really kind of doing new interesting things in backup and replication. And the way that it works is that you have a single appliance that they call a brick, or you may have several appliances. Or if for a smaller site, you might have a virtual brick, and they then will replicate to your secondary location. So you may have a brick somewhere else. And from there, you can do things like live mount. You can cloud mount, so you can recover into the public cloud. And you can do things like cloud out is their term for pushing out archives into lower cost cloud storage. Now, I guess the pros and cons of Rubrik are the big positive. If you've got a very large environment, it's very, very simple to deploy with these individual bricks. You don't need to be setting up proxy servers and media agents. You've just got a single brick, and then you can scale that out depending on how much you need to protect. Another benefit is that because this is a relatively new product that's only been developed in the last handful of years, it doesn't have a lot of the legacy baggage of some of the other products. So you get a really clean, simple UI, and it's the same interface across the virtual bricks, so Rubrik Air or Air Pro, as the physical bricks themselves, which isn't always the case with some other products. And the one downside here, it's not necessarily a downside, but it's Rubrik isn't necessarily economical unless you have a relatively large environment. So it tends to work really well if you've got hundreds of terabytes and hundreds of workloads to protect. It doesn't really scale down for businesses smaller than that. Although if you work with a service provider like a Data Barracks, then we are able to make that a bit more cost effective and work for slightly smaller businesses. So that was all the tech. Let's see if we can answer the question then. Is combined backup and replication for you? Right. I doubt that's the best quad bike in the world, and I certainly doubt it's the best jet ski, but it looks like an awful lot of fun. Equally, this isn't a wildly practical guitar, having a double neck, 12 string and 6 string, but if you need to play Stairway to Heaven, it's the one that does something for you. So we can summarize this pretty easily. If you've got very advanced, very specific needs for both backup and replication, you really need to use a specific best of breed product for both. Larger businesses, anyone in a highly regulated industry, a single product is probably not for you. With that being said, if you've got an advanced replication or backup need, but you can afford to make some compromises on the other, then a combined product does make a lot of sense. So for instance, if you need to recover quickly, but you don't need a lot of historic versions, Zerto Terrific is going to do the job for you. If you need to keep a lot of historic versions, you're in a very regulated industry, but uptime isn't quite as critical, then COMMVAULT will do that job for you very, very well on its own. And if you need something that does a bit of both, maybe Veeam's the product that works for you. And I think that's really the answer. And I think I guess the final thing that I'll add here is, so we, as a service provider, we provide both backup as a service and disaster recovery as a service, and we have some customers who will take both of those products with us. We'll have a customer who uses a Segra for backup, and they'll use Zerto for their replication because they need both of those things. But we also have some customers that are able to make do with just a single product and have that take care of all of the requirements for them. So if we kind of skip back very, very quickly and look at this vendor landscape, there's probably not a single product here that is right for everyone. I mean, certainly not, but there's definitely one that's going to be right for you, and it's just a case of kind of getting those requirements nailed down and then seeing how they fit across each of those products. So here are the list of resources that we mentioned, and a link to the previous webinar. Now, we have run ever so slightly over today, so I'm afraid I won't keep everyone for questions. I'll run through all of these bits and get back to everyone individually. I do want to respect your day and make sure you can get back to work at 11 o'clock like we said we would allow it. So thank you very much for joining us, and I hope we will see you again on our next webinar.